Chapter 16. Diderot and the French Privilege System. 1. The 1763 Letter on the Book Trade. In the humid intellectual ferment of pre-revolutionary France, the great theft of property encountered its most eloquent and perhaps most conflicted defender, Denis Diderot. In 1763, the great editor of the Encyclopedia was commissioned by the Paris Guild of Booksellers to write a formal defense of their crumbling monopolies. The resulting document, the Letter on the Book Trade, Lettre sur le commerce de la librairie, remains a masterpiece of descriptive rhetoric, and a turning point in how humanity perceived the products of the mind. Diderot didn't rest his case on the old dusty arguments of royal privilege, the idea that a monopoly was a gift from a king. Instead, he reached into the very soul of the Enlightenment to pull out a new weapon, the natural right. With a pen dipped in both passion and legal precision, he posed a question that still haunts intellectual property law. What property can a man belong to if a work of the mind, the unique fruit of his upbringing, his studies, his vigils, his research, his observations, his finest hours, the purest substance of his soul, does not belong to him? In this vision, Diderot was describing the enclosure of the interior. He argued that while a piece of land exists outside a man, a book is an extension of his very biological and spiritual being. It was the purest substance of the soul. By framing authorship this way, Diderot turned the fence into a sacred boundary. However, there was a calculated mercantile motive beneath his poetry. Diderot argued that because this right was natural and eternal, an author should be allowed to sell that eternity to a publisher. He was effectively building a moral bridge that allowed the corporate guilds of Paris to claim perpetual ownership of French culture, under the guise of protecting the starving genius. It was the ultimate refinement of the property system, using the sanctity of the individual to lock the doors of the collective heritage. 2. Privileges as state approval versus natural rights. To truly grasp the suffocating atmosphere of 18th century France, you must understand that the great theft didn't just steal land. It stole the legal right to exist. In this era, the intellectual landscape was dominated by the privilège du roi, the king's privilege. This wasn't a modern right that one claimed. It was a vertical, hierarchical grace handed down from the throne. A privilege was a royal decree that granted a printer the exclusive right to produce a book. But it carried a hidden, razor-sharp edge. It was the primary mechanism of total state censorship. In this reality, the fence of property was used as a divine filter for truth. A book without a privilege was an outlaw, a bastard, an orphan. It had no standing in a court of law, and its creator, the author, was a non-entity. To obtain this privilege, a manuscript had to pass through the hands of the censeur royal, royal censors. If a text was deemed dangerous to the Catholic Church, scandalous to the court, or critical of the king's ministers, the privilege was denied. Effectively, the property was killed before it could be born. This was the ultimate enclosure. The state claimed ownership over the very boundaries of public thought. This created a profound existential crisis for Diderot, Rousseau, and the other philosophes. They found themselves caught in a predatory trap. On one hand, they wanted their works to be recognized as natural property, a right inherent to them as human beings, independent of any king's whim. They argued that because their ideas were the purest substance of their souls, they owned them by natural law. This was the great Enlightenment gamble, the attempt to transform the privilege, a gift from the throne, into a right, a fact of nature. They believed that if they could make their books sacred private property, the king could no longer reach into their minds and silence them. However, as we peel back the layers of this strategy, we see the tragic irony of the great theft.
In their desperate struggle to flee the censorship of the monarch, the Enlightenment thinkers built the foundations for the censorship of the market. By arguing that ideas were private property, they stripped them of their status as common heritage. They unwittingly paved the way for a world where the fence would no longer be guarded by a king's soldier, but a corporation's lawyer. In the landscape of the 18th century, the shift from privilege to right looked like liberation. But in the long arc of history, it was simply the transition from a feudal enclosure of the mind to a capitalist one, where the only truth allowed to live is the truth that can be exclusively owned and profitably sold.
3. The conflict between provincial booksellers and the Paris Guild. The geography of the Great Theft in 18th century France was defined by a brutal asymmetric war between the center and the periphery. This wasn't merely a commercial dispute, it was a struggle over the very right to participate in the intellectual life of the nation. At the heart of this conflict was the Paris Guild of Booksellers, a predatory cartel that held a literal stranglehold on the French mind. Because of their proximity to the king's court and the royal censors, the Paris booksellers managed to secure nearly all the lucrative privileges for the most essential books: the Bibles, the classics, the law codes, the prayer books that every household in the kingdom was required to possess. This concentration of intellectual estates in the hands of a few Parisian families left the provincial booksellers in cities like Lyon, Rouen, and Avignon in a state of systematic starvation. These provincial printers were the dispossessed of the book trade. Denied the legal right to print the most profitable works, they were pushed to the margins of the law. They became the pirates of the Enlightenment, operating in a vast gray market of unauthorized editions. They argued that the Paris privileges were feudal relics, invisible fences that prevented the light of knowledge from reaching the common people in the provinces. The conflict was visceral. The Paris Guild, acting as a private police force, sent inspectors across the country to hunt for illicit presses. These inspectors had the authority to burst into provincial workshops, smash the heavy wooden frames of the presses, and burn pirated stocks of books in the public squares. To the Paris monopolists, this was the protection of property. To the provincial printer, it was an act of economic terrorism. This war of the booksellers was a crucial precursor to the revolution. The provincial printers, in their desperate fight for survival, began to articulate a radical new vision: the public domain. They argued that once a book had served its initial purpose of rewarding the author and the first printer, the fence should be torn down, and the text should belong to the entire nation. By defying the Paris monopolies, these pirates ensured that the forbidden works of the philosophes reached every corner of France, proving that the great theft of knowledge could only be maintained through force, and that the walls of privilege were beginning to crumble under the weight of a people's need to read. 4. The revolutionary legislation of 1791 and 1793. When the Bastille fell in 1789, the old fences of the privilege system were among the first structures to be cast into the revolutionary fires. The National Assembly, driven by the intoxicating ideals of liberté, égalité, fraternité, initially viewed copyright as a Bastille of the mind, a tool of the ancien regime used to suppress the truth. In the first flush of revolutionary zeal, they declared that the communication of thoughts and opinions is one of the most precious rights of man. And for a brief moment, it appeared that the great theft of intellectual property might be entirely undone in the name of the common good. However, the chaos of unregulated printing soon threatened the very authors the revolution claimed to celebrate. Without protection, writers like Beaumarchais found their works being stolen by unscrupulous printers who paid them nothing. This led to the landmark laws of 1791 and 1793, which sought to find a republican balance between the individual and the collective. These laws were the official birth of the modern Droit du auteur, author's right. They famously declared that the most sacred of all properties is the work of the mind. But the French Revolution added a crucial democratic limitation that prevented this sacred property from becoming a new hereditary aristocracy. The 1793 law granted authors the exclusive right to their work for their lifetime, plus 10 years for their heirs. After that precise moment, the law mandated a return to the commons. The work fell into the public domain, becoming the property of the entire French Republic. This was the Revolution's way of redistributing the great theft. They acknowledged the creator's labor as a form of property, but they insisted that no individual could own a piece of human culture forever. The fence was no longer a royal gift, it was a temporary lease granted by the people. By setting a hard limit on ownership, the revolutionaries ensured that while the author could harvest the fruit of their genius for a season, the seeds of that genius would eventually belong to the common soil, nourishing the minds of all citizens in a free state. 5. The dematerialization of the artistic object. As the 18th century drew to a close, the concept of property underwent its most ghostly and profound transformation: dematerialization. Before this era, property was understood as something you could touch: the physical book, the metal plate, the block of marble. But through the philosophical debates of the Enlightenment and the legal codes of the Revolution, the property became the abstract idea. This was the ultimate abstraction of the great theft. It was no longer necessary to steal a physical object to be a thief. You could steal property simply by repeating a melody or imitating a narrative structure. The artistic object was stripped of its physical body and turned into a legal ghost, a concept called propriété incorporelle, incorporeal property. This allowed the enclosure of the mind to become total and invisible. The state no longer just guarded the print shop, it guarded the vibrations of the air and the patterns of thought. This dematerialization laid the groundwork for the 19th century world of international patents and trademarks, where ownership would no longer be limited to things you could hold in your hand, but would extend to the very way we think and express ourselves. The French Revolution had sought to free the body, but in creating the sacred property of the mind, it had built a new invisible set of walls that would define the modern world's intellectual landscape.